Now, our keynote speaker tonight, I have known for a long time, another former veteran in the PAINWeek arena. He's been part of the conference, he was part of the conference in 2011, so you'll recognize him easily. Dr. Daniel Carr is the founder and director of the interprofessional program in pain research, education, and policy at Tufts University School of Medicine. He is widely published in pain research, evidence-based medicine, and the social and political aspects of pain relief. He has done and written about just about everything in this field. He was the founding editor of IASP's Pain Clinical Updates, was the lead editor for pain trials in the Cochrane Review Group on pain, palliative, and supportive care, and serves on editorial boards of pain-related journals. His honors are many and include the APS's Fordyce Distinguished Service and Educational Excellence Awards, the AAPM's LePay and Founders Awards, and citations from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carr.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I just really have to say how thrilled I am, first of all, to be sharing the stage with Michael and Kevin, and how remarkable it is that the very gripping comments that Kevin read really fit very well with what I'm going to be speaking to you about tonight. In discussing how we would frame the title with Deborah Weiner, about whom I cannot speak highly enough in terms of her organizational management of the growth of this organization, she pointed out that Daryl Fossa, who does all the graphics, would appreciate if we could frame this in a way that would help graphics. So I cranked up the provocative nature a little bit, and you can see in the poster outside, to make the title read something like, "A Public Health View of Pain Education. Have we been backwards, upside down, or both?" So I'm going to walk you through things. I'm not going to keep you very long. You'll make the reception just fine. I don't really have anything relevant to disclose, and the learning objectives that I hope we'll achieve by the end of this talk are to talk about what you just heard from Kevin, that there are numerous compelling, qualitative, intersubjective expressions of pain, such as narrative, but also in art and cinema. I'm going to touch upon how the IASP definition of pain served as a historical rationale to focus research and also pain curricula. But they focused them on a biochemical and physiological micro scale. And my first point is that from a patient-centered viewpoint, that focus actually has created a backwards situation. And I'll walk through that. I'm also going to talk about public health. I'm now a professor in public health. As the director of the program at Tufts, we've always been located in the Department of Public Health since we began in 1999. But there's a lot more to public health than just dealing with problems that affect a lot of people. And one of the things that happens in public health is that you look at problems as complex top-down processes. And I'm going to frame for you pain as one of those processes, especially chronic pain, and talk about how there's an emerging field called social neuroscience. There's a good article on it in Wikipedia, actually, and how we can best understand pain in those terms. And finally, I'm going to conclude that the traditional approach to pain education that we see changing here through the work of everyone at PAINWeek, including yourself, represents something that's an upside-down process, because it's not a bottom-up process, it's a top-down process. Last year, I had the privilege of presenting a talk, preparing a talk with the author, Melanie Thernstrom. And the topic of our talk we chose as Through the Looking Glass. And here, this is from Lewis Carroll's original book of that name. You're seeing Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Well, what did we mean by through the looking glass? What we meant is that, on the one hand, there's an enormous and compelling and authentic, qualitative, literary, narrative, experience-based block of information about pain. That's largely been ignored or shied away from by people who study biochemical measurements and brain imaging and so on. But in recent years, these have begun to converge to the point where one is reinforcing the other. Well, one of the interesting things to think about is that if we create pain in our own minds through the neuromatrix, what we're doing when we analyze this is rediscovering what people have known for millennia. The Buddha, whose given name was Siddhartha Gautama, pointed out well over 1,500 years ago that we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts, and with our thoughts we make the world. I think this is a very important concept for anybody interested in the phenomenon of pain, especially chronic pain, and pain education to keep in mind. Our brains are set up to make worlds. It doesn't take a lot for us to make a world. This is a picture that was taken by one of the realist post-war French street photographers. What you're seeing here is what it looks like viewing from the stage outwards at a park in Paris when a marionette or puppet show was being performed. And if you took each of these kids, that looked to be about 6 or 7, if you took them aside separately and said, you know, Pierre, this is just a puppet, right? And Pierre would say, well, yeah, I know it's a puppet, but I really got into it. And if you were to take a similar picture of you know, the latest movies and so on, you could find audiences with this same enthralled emotion, and they would know they're just watching a movie. And that's because we construct reality, and it doesn't take much for us to layer a reality around our beliefs. In fact, everyday normal consciousness depends upon a narrative. The creation of a narrative is a primal feature of what it means to have consciousness. There are other features, namely being aware that something's going on, putting yourself inside a certain portion of space, having a sense that time is passing and the images get refreshed over time, placing ourselves within the space that surrounds us and in the time that's passing us. We also detect sensory input that can be nociception. And when we do all this, we have continuous access to memory, to appraisal of the meaning of what all these things are about, and emotion or affect. That may be why narrative medicine, which is seeing an explosion in the last few years, has an engaging, authentic, and persuasive power that far exceeds the most carefully prepared meta-analysis or quantitative data. These narratives that are clustered around pain topics are strongly shaped by the context, and that context includes culture and social interactions. Actually, just telling the narrative, having your voice heard, or if you're a filmmaker, having your film seen, or having your art watched by people who understand it is itself a very healing phenomenon. When the IASP task force on taxonomy convened and started to set up definitions, they arrived at this definition for pain. And we teach this. It's an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential tissue damage, or described in terms of such damage. I can tell you, having sat on that committee, you would not believe the passion and fights and fury over every single word. I think the committee was finally shut down because they were incorrigible. They swept us all out of office and just figured, time to start again, like the Boston Red Sox seem to be doing. Just forget it. Anyway, why was the IASP inclined to choose this definition? Well, you got to remember, IASP was formed in the 70s. And over the over the preceding couple of decades, there had been enormous success in introducing electrophysiological measurements of nerves and figuring out what impulses went to where and tracing pathways. And also, through the relatively recent advent then of radioimmunoassay, it was possible to measure hormones. So this was very biomedical in nature, even though the wording itself need not be. It evolved in a biomedical way. And I think, unfortunately, it's been followed by a progression towards reductionism and impersonal framings of pain that are now being changed by pioneers such as Judy Watt-Watson in Canada, Beth Murinson at Hopkins, and the Mayday Fund through its support of these and other initiatives. This concept that you start with something small, the nociceptor, or even a portion of the nociceptor, like an ion channel or a peptide neurotransmitter, and then you layer something on top of that, and that's pain. And you layer something on top of that, and it's suffering. And you layer something on top of that. This was embodied in John Lozier's onion picture. John is a phenomenal person. He's a past president of IASP and a personal friend. But I think this idea of building stuff up from little towards big has misled us. So, just proceeding forward, remember we were talking about consciousness. Well, we know a little bit about consciousness. Consciousness is a phenomenon that's called emergent. That word in this context doesn't mean like emergency room or emergency care. It means that some property occurs when you put together a bunch of elements, and that property transcends what any one of those elements could achieve. Well, the classic view about pain was just that it's a passive registration of nociception. And I thought you might get a kick out of this. I recently finished a chapter on the history of pain. This book was published in the year I was born, which was 1948. Famous book, Wolf and Wolf. I thought, well, wonder what they have to say about the brain. So I looked up brain in the index. How many people think there is an entry for brain in the index? Well, I'll give away the answer. There's one entry. It says brain, insensitivity of. They were talking about the fact that if you poke it or put a little electric, nothing happens. And I thought, well, maybe I'm looking up the wrong word. What about cortex? There's one entry for cortex. Cortex, insensitivity of. So the only mention that the brain got was to say there's nothing really happening there. But in fact, we now know, looking back at them, they had it completely backwards because the brain is what generates pain. Our current view is that pain results from a network of brain structures. Nociception is one of the inputs, but we all know we can be distracted. We can find some purpose to pain. So nociception doesn't really strongly, directly dictate what the intensity level is. We also have these other inputs like meaning or memory. And we actively construct a continually evolving internal model of reality. Neuroscientists have written on this. One neuroscientist, Victor Johnson, said, "We believe we live in a world that's full of sounds and colors and smells and tastes, because this is what we experience every day of our lives. And there appears to be no reason for thinking otherwise. But if rotten eggs smell bad, it's not because hydrogen sulfide smells bad, but because the human brain has evolved a neural organization that can generate unpleasant sensations for those aspects of the world that affect gene survival." So when we take our classic traditional model of building up the world of pain from little tiny things, it feels good. And we like this concept of emergence. The concept of emergence is not a bad concept. One way to explain it to students is to say, well, imagine the pieces of a mechanical watch placed on a table. None of those pieces alone could tell time. But if you put them together in a certain way, you achieve a result whose functionality transcends what any of the elements could be capable of. But very, very few people say, well, okay, that's well and good. We build the watch from the bottom up, but why did we want a watch in the first place? Who cared about telling time? What's going on is that there's something that's a little harder to define and to pin down, but there's a desire or a motive to do something, and that motive generates these little things, but it didn't start with the little things. And there's tons of examples about this. I'll get to this a little later, but you can think about bricks in a cathedral. Many cathedrals are built of bricks. A cathedral is not about assembling bricks. It's about something which is a greater aspiration that is manifest through little things. And I think this is a very important concept for understanding why the notion that pain education has to begin in a biomedical arena may be flawed and why this is being shifted. We know through views of the brain that's living and experiencing pain on MRI that there's a network of areas in the brain. We also know that many of these areas that light up during our own pain light up equally well when we watch someone else experiencing pain. We're beginning to understand that pain is primarily a social phenomenon. Is this a new insight? Well, if Darwin were alive today, people might have called him a social neuroscientist. Darwin wrote that all sentient beings develop through natural selection in such a way that pleasant sensations serve as their guide, and especially the pleasure derived from sociability and from loving our families. This made me think that we're at a conference where we talk about analgesics. I think we already know what's the perfect analgesic, and it's the most widely used, and it has the fewest side effects. If a child bumps its head and is crying, mother will nurture the child, and in the vast majority of instances, the pain will go away, things will restore towards normal. I think there's a very important lesson here for the importance of social inclusion and nurturing for the process of pain. In contrast, there's also a huge literature that documents that pain sufferers are outsiders. There's a lot of literature that links pain and stigma or humiliation, for example, if pain is deliberately inflicted, as in torture, or marginalization of the person with pain. We hear that all the time when patients present testimonies, as they did to the Institute of Medicine. People that you might term outsiders, whether on the basis of racial, ethnic, or linguistic minority status, being very young, being old, people with cancer, HIV, substance abuse, poor people, homeless people, all of these are documented to be at special risk for underassessment and undertreatment of pain. We know this through work of Carmen Green, David Morris, Kathy Lash, and so on. So there's a link between society's valuing or not valuing an individual's experience and the aggressiveness of pain treatment. Let's turn back to this Institute of Medicine report, because it really was a landmark event in pain research and also pain education. Well, the IOM was not the first body to describe pain as a public health issue. The World Health Organization has been doing this for several years. What does it mean that it is a public health issue? If you asked the average clinician who hadn't much thought about this, or me a few years ago, I would have said, well, sure, it's a public health issue. And if you pressed me and said, well, Dan, why? I'd say, well, a lot of people have it and it costs a lot. This is true. But there are several other important aspects that make something a public health issue. One is that there's an element of preventability, as in the transition from acute to chronic pain. Another is that it makes sense to think about this phenomenon on a population-wide basis. Another is that there's a relationship to socioeconomic status, and I was thrilled, and there was no prior coordination when Kevin read the letter from this year's grand prize winner, and he mentioned that. There's also a human rights dimension, including inequities, as well as a moral imperative to transform our thinking. When we start to think about health care as involving more than just the individual, we move into the realm of social networks. Christakis and others have contrasted the conventional perspective on medical care. We have a doctor or other healthcare provider, the patient, and that's it, and you measure direct outcomes. But we understand that that's oversimplified. The expanded current perspective on medical care that is certainly exemplified by care of patients with pain is that, yes, there's a healthcare provider, yes, there's a patient, yes, there are direct outcomes, but the patient has many social ties, and these social contacts have collateral outcomes. We know this in the clinic when we see relationships strained, either by the stress of having chronic pain or by the financial consequences of that, where we hear people denied a disability, treated unfairly, not having access to medication. We know there's a whole ripple effect out there. So pain is a public health issue. My friend Mac Gallagher actually was writing on this in 1999, same year that we established our Tufts program. He said, chronic pain is a public health problem crying out for a reorganization of the manner in which the healthcare system manages pain. Informed community primary care physicians contribute their expertise in what he described as essentially a medical home, although the word wasn't used then. And this expertise is combined with their knowledge of health, family, and other psychosocial factors and community resources. His idea was that pain medicine specialists would provide consultative support to primary care providers and other clinicians. The IOM blueprint could not be more clear in declaring that pain is a public health problem. But it goes further, and this is relevant to why all of you have gathered here and why I commend all of you, and I'd ask you to look around and realize that you are yourselves or ourselves amidst our own supportive community of pain carers. Because They went further and said education is a central part of the necessary cultural transformation of the approach to pain. There were a number of features that needed to be addressed. There needed to be expansion and redesign of the curriculum. There needed to be a transformation of understanding, improvement of curriculum and education for clinicians, increased number of clinicians. You heard that clip at the beginning from Sean Mackey talking about one pain clinic for every 30,000, or one pain specialist for every 30,000 people. There's also an interesting observation that success in team care probably begins with interdisciplinary training so that members of different professions become comfortable with collaboration. If time permitted, we could drill down on that statement and say, well, isn't that actually addressing the whole social network involved with chronic pain? We were happy they mentioned our PrEP program in education, and I've got to express my own gratitude for the booth here that was provided by Deborah and colleagues, and gratitude to Emily Kiley, our admissions director, who will be there at... Well,
Time's up.
Time's up. Well,
here.
Now is this? Wait, well, hold it. Wait. Okay. Let's try it.
You got a reprieve.
That happens when I get excited. Sometimes the lightning comes out from the fingertips, and I try to I don't want to scare people, so we're just going to keep it low key. But you better behave, otherwise I'll sack you. I don't know what. I don't see what happened, but anyway. We also have seen the really laudable actions and what they've accomplished through the PAINS group led by Myra Christopher, Coalition to Transform Advanced Care, PAINWeek, and so on. Many, many people in this pain community are advancing the IOM goals. So why don't we ask, well, what if we really believed pain were a public health problem? What would we do different? Well, I think we'd accept that many of the important real-world phenomena that we deal with are intrinsically collective. They're community-based. We would adopt an integrated, multi-level community approach that incorporates cultural values, socioeconomic status, social networks, connectivity, and we would do these through these organized processes like REMS and DAWN. We would inform policy by concepts of human rights. No, this is, I think the battery must be, I'm not doing anything. Huh? I'm not doing anything. Inform policy by concepts of human rights, social justice, for example, access to assessment and care, economics and employment. We would allocate resources at a population level, and there are success stories in education, even the community distribution of naloxone to treat communities at risk for a high prevalence of overdosage. Yes, we'd inform these by those microprocesses like genetics and pharmacokinetics, but they wouldn't dominate the process. In so doing, we would take a system that's broken and try to help its own self-healing, because that's how systems repair themselves. Now, speaking of systems, when public health people look at problems, they draw things called systems maps. So this was a systems map I had nothing to do with. This is on obesity, and I'm not gonna quiz you on this, but my point is as follows. If you really drill down and kind of squint and read the fine print, a portion of the problem of obesity comes from physiology. There's no getting around it, but physiology hasn't changed in 50,000 years. What's changed are things like how food is produced and marketed. What are the psychological pressures to eat one kind of food versus another? What about physical activity, either community-wide or in the individual? So yes, the microphysiology is important, you can't get away from it, but that's not what made the problem. People are starting to apply these concepts to opioid treatment. This is from an article by Wakeland et al. In Pain Medicine in 2011. They were modeling this to answer questions such as, well, if we invested to make every single opioid ever dispensed abuse or misuse resistant, how much of a difference would that make in death rates? Questions like that. So going back to this IOM report, they cited the value of a public health and community-based approach. They said that many features of the problem of pain lend themselves to these approaches. Concern about the large number of people affected, disparities in occurrence and treatment, and the goal of prevention. Public health education can help counter the myths, misunderstandings, stereotypes, and stigma that hinder better care. How about education? How would we change our education? Well, people are starting to do this. So I'm optimistic. But to me, the starting point would be to take the word biopsychosocial, which is a perfectly good word, and take a closer look at it, because in most of the curricula and most of the books on pain, 80–90% is biology. Chapter 1 is always about biochemistry, mediators, receptors, channels. Maybe 10% is about psychology, and a few percent what's left over is social. I think we ought to introduce the word socio-psychobiological to describe pain, because that's what we deal with in our everyday lives. And we often find ourselves feeling confused or inadequate. We've learned all that stuff about genes and ion channels and peptides. It's just not helping us when the patient and family come in and they're in turmoil. And the reason is it's nothing wrong with us. It's that the explanation at those levels can't explain the real world. We should inform our education by this emerging neuroscience field called social neuroscience. The focus of social neuroscience is behaviors, social processes, and only secondarily does it study properties of neurons to explain those social properties. We are starting to advocate and carry out interprofessional team teaching, and I think an important aspect of that is respect for other members of the team. In other words, reprogramming the social forces. And we should do this in a population-based context. We need to take into consideration social, cultural, environmental, and economic forces. So the educational process I've talked about. In the first place, you could say it was backwards, because instead of taking the patient-centered approach, we took a biology-centered approach and tried to persuade people that if they knew the biology, things would work out with patients, and they didn't, they haven't. You could also say that our approach has been upside down, because when we focus upon nociceptors, or even portions of nociceptors like receptors or intracellular effectors, we divert attention away from the reality of pain, which is population-based, it's intersubjective, and there's an important moral dimension. So our shortcomings are like, as I mentioned earlier, studying bricks to learn about cathedrals. We'll never understand why someone wanted a cathedral in the first place if we just look at the bricks. Same thing, you can look at resistors or parts of a circuit in a radio, and you wouldn't understand why was the radio built. Why do people want to hear a broadcast or music? We could say you should study art by spending a few years studying pigment chemistry and electrophysiology of the retina, and people would think, well, you're crazy. It's true, it's part of the process, but it doesn't explain the process, it's top down. You could study the pattern of tidal gullies and not realize that the phenomenon of tide comes from this moon that's circling the Earth. So there's innumerable examples of mistaking the small things for what's driving the big thing, when actually the big thing is evolving and selecting the smaller scale mediators. And there's another, actually more negative thing. If we take health professional students and indoctrinate them that these impersonal, timeless, micro-scale mechanisms are what pain is all about, well, we may predispose them to withdraw or avoid entirely the interactions that we face every day in the clinic that are highly charged emotionally, they're awkward, or they're threatening. We're giving them the okay to do that because we're saying, well, that's not really what pain is. Pain is about these biochemical things. So we've adopted in our program a kind of top-down onion where we say, yeah, there's pain, but let's think about that as a community thing. We need to do research on pain at the community level. We certainly need better education. I think everybody in this room agrees to that. And the education won't stick unless we can make proper policies. So what I've done is to suggest that the traditional view where the textbook has all these biochemical things in chapter 1, where the brain is barely even mentioned, only to say it doesn't feel pain directly, is backwards, and it's also upside down. But at the same time, I see that the spirit in PAINWeek and the spirit of all of you is a tremendous antidote to this, and it's going in a good direction. What I've done is, we have a blog for our program. It was started by one of our then students, now faculty, who had lost a son to a prolonged illness that involved pain, and she decided she would shift her career, which had been a neonatal ICU nurse, and focus on pain. And she made a prize-winning blog. She now studies how social networking allows individuals with chronic illness to overcome isolation. and she's written that blog. That's Pam Ressler. And it's a very simple URL. It's just sites.tufts.edu/prep. So if you want to read more about this, there's a lot of stuff posted there. And we also have our booth staffed by Emily Kiley, as I said. And I just want to conclude with once again thanking the organizers of Pain Week. I'm in awe of their administrative and organizational talents, and thanking Michael and Kevin for sharing the podium. Thank you very much, and I guess I'll turn it back to Michael.